For the private sector to compete and to compete with their unique innovations, they need their secret sauce. So don't overstep into where their secret sauce might lie. Respect that and only carry those standards so far. Allow competition, allow innovation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Today is part 5 of our season on ISAM. That's in-space, servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. In the last episode, we talked about U.S. national strategies, and now I want to widen it up a little bit to the international. So it's my pleasure to host Dr. Brian Weeden and Karen Jones. Karen is a space economist and senior analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. And Brian is the Director of Program and Planning at Secure World Foundation. He's also one of the founding members of CONFERS, which we showcased in our first episode in the ISAM series. And I know he's got a whole host of other experience in the science and technology policymaking world. So you guys, thank you very much, both of you, for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start wide, and then we'll kind of see where it goes from there. But Brian, I'll start with you to answer this first big question for our audience. So the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty states that the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space shall require authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate state party to the treaty. So Article 6, talk about how that relates to in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing in terms of the non-governmental entity, i.e. commercial, and then that whole continuing supervision.
Well, thank you. And that's an important question that countries and states parties to the treaty have been wrestling for. All of commercial space activities. What's new is that most countries, the United States and most others, have some processes in place to do that oversight and authorization for the historical kinds of things companies have done in space. Things like communication satellites, remote sensing satellites, occasionally launch. But now there's this whole new growing array of commercial space activities, including all the things that are under ISAM. And most countries do not have a process in place to do that authorization and that continuing supervision. So the United States, as well as Japan, France, United Kingdom, several others, are all looking at what do they need to put in place to both enable these new commercial activities that are included under ISAM, while also complying with their obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and ensuring that those commercial space activities are being done in accordance with the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, the other major principles of international law, and also dealing with things like liability that, again, goes back to those launching states I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more later.
Karen, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think this is just a natural evolution as to where we are in the space industry. If you go back to the days of the automobile, it's just an evolution in terms of how do we address, liability and damages as well. The thing that comes to mind for me is tow truck insurance, where tow truck operators face unique risks when they're out on the road. They need insurance. And they're concerned about third-party claims for property damage, for instance. So as we move to a more certain regulatory environment with the National Space Council, leading the way as to how this will shake out, I think it's going to be important to understand how we address these, potential liabilities and damages. Again, it's just a natural evolution, and I think this is something we are expecting to evolve. And I think it's going to really help the private industry. They need regulatory certainty, and they need a better understanding of who's going to regulate and monitor their activities.
Yeah, well, I can't help it, but there have been recent developments in the U.S. In terms of addressing some of these things. So I think there are lots of other questions I wanted to get to today, but maybe now is the time to talk about these things. Brian, can you just explain Would you be okay with that if we talked about
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. Yep.
Okay. So before we started recording, you had a nice little explanation of some background. So could you just give that for us in terms of we've got kind of two opposing things happening right now?
Yeah, we do, but I want to turn the clock back almost 10 years to when this conversation started. During the Obama administration, Congress passed a piece of legislation that identified this gap between the existing licensing processes and all of the new commercial stuff that was happening. Didn't explicitly talk about ISAM, but ISAM was part of that. The Obama administration proposed this thing they called mission authorization as a way to address that gap. And the Trump administration included mission authorization, the mention of it under the 2020 National Space Policy, but neither really defined what they meant by that or kind of laid out a process by which that would happen. Late last year, the Space Council under the Biden administration officially started a process to define what they mean by mission authorization and this in-space oversight. That process included some listening sessions with the public and with industry, and then a multi-month long interagency process. On the other side, of course, this doesn't involve just the White House, it involves Congress, because if we're talking about new regulatory authorities and potentially new budget, that's something only Congress can do. So just recently, the House Subcommittee on Space introduced a piece of legislation co-sponsored by Representative Lucas and Representative Babin that proposed another way to address this, a certification process that was different than the mission authorization process discussed previously. And then most recently, as the committee was going to mark that up, the White House released their legislative proposal for mission authorization based on all of the work they've been doing over the last several months. So now we have two different ideas that are on the table of how to address this. The Senate has been working on something, but has not officially released anything. There's going to be a process over the next several months to figure out what this is going to look like. And of course, the answer is you have to get the Congress and the White House to all agree on something.
Yeah. We're kind of talking about in terms of like licensing or certifications or that overall kind of mission authorization and supervision piece. We're talking about, I guess, competing responsibilities, like how that division of responsibilities is gonna play out. And of course, the end of the game, the end of the day, it's about division of budget and resources for those things as well. So,
yeah, and what's being discussed is, not only who in the government does this, and there's a discussion of what might go to the Department of Commerce, might go to the Department of Transportation, but also how they would do it. Is there a defined process? Is there a set timeline? Are there restrictions on what the government can regulate and cannot? Are there, things that they're allowed to include? That is all part of the debate.
Thanks. So, Karen, do you have any insight on how, like you mentioned something earlier about how regulation is good for business, actually, because it gives them peace of mind, if you will. So do you want to comment on some of these developments?
I'm really eager to see, standards really take effect and a greater agreement across industry on interoperability. That's going to be the key here. Years ago, I read a book called The Box, and it was about the intermodal container industry. And that was really the key to globalization, the ability to have these containers over ships and trains, et cetera. And it just made a huge difference. It put some longshoremen out of business, but it certainly was a wonderful way to streamline trade across the world. And to some extent, that's going to happen here. So we have national interests and we have private sector interests. And one of the things I'm watching closely is how does CONFERS and standards, how does this come into play and work in a way that's consensus-based and that, lifts all ships, so to speak. So that's going to be key here, voluntary, non-binding industry consensus standards. that's going to be the foundation for space-based capabilities for a viable in-space economy. It's going to take some time, but I think it's key, and to do it in a fair way that's reasonable and non-discriminatory. There are vested equities now. The longer we wait, the more vested equities take place. So I view this as really urgent. Right now, the industry is still somewhat malleable and young enough where we can coalesce around hopefully the right standards. If we wait, we're going to have silos of vested equities at war with each other. And let's hope that doesn't happen. Hopefully we can move quickly on beyond who's regulating and what are the standards to get to true interoperability, because ISAM is something that it is going to be really an international kind of market in space. And so we really need those standards agreed upon soon.
Right. So the standards piece, I mean, you mentioned the kind of voluntary standards, certainly the international aspect of the space industry. I wonder how those kind of voluntary efforts at the international level with CONFERS and the interoperability, I wonder how those might play into, for example, the U.S. Framework for mission authorization or any other nation's framework for mission authorization.
There's a direct link there. There's absolutely a direct link there. So one of the original intentions behind creating CONFERS and having the work industry standards was to have the standards influence the regulatory regime. There's actually a circular from the Office of Management and Budget dating back to the Clinton administration on the requirement for the U.S. government to base regulations on what they call voluntary consensus standards, which is a term of art about a certain way that you come up with the standards. And that was sort of the intention behind CONFERS, and that has always been sort of there in the U.S. government. Now, the U.S. government's process has not gotten to that point where they're kind of talking about the specifics of any of this stuff yet. We're still having a higher level discussion. But other countries, such as Japan, the United Kingdom, and France, have all put forward their own proposals for regulatory frameworks to deal with ISAM and in-space, other in-space activities. And several of them explicitly mention CONFERS or link to the standards that CONFERS has been developing as part of their influence and part of what they're going to be requiring.
Yeah, so you talk about, all right, you've introduced the idea of competing ideas, right? So you have France or Japan or the US putting out their own ideas for what, but they're each different launching states, right? But there is this sense of kind of competition, even amongst what Karen was saying with interoperability, right? Should we use Northrop Grumman's coupling as a universal coupling, or should we use somebody else's that's developed by, ESA or something? What is going to become that universal standard? So let's talk about the competition a little bit. Where are the tensions? Karen, can I start with you?
I think it's going to be very important to watch how this plays out. Obviously, gamesmanship occurs here, but I also think countries realize that international cooperation is going to benefit us all. So hopefully it will go in that direction. I was looking at history as, okay, how did the gas nozzle come into play? And I was researching that. There's a fellow by the name of, I love his name, Sylvanus Freelove Bowser. What a name.
Wow.
But he
a child of the 60s.
I know, it's a great name. He came up with this gas nozzle, and it was, it slowly took off. But the thing is, with cars in the US, they don't go to China and they don't go to Europe. And there's not a whole lot of, cross transportation to these other continents. In space, we're going to have a much more cohesive system, and we will want to bring our assets together in various ways. So I don't know how useful it is to look at how history has played out. And we have to remind ourselves to kind of think in terms of the international standards here. How do we get there quickly too? And certainly the EV market there's 4 different standards now. So that's very awkward. Tesla, China has a standard, Europe has a standard. Looking at that is not a good corollary for how we're going to cooperate in space. So hopefully we'll come up with something that's agreeable across the different continents, and it'll work well in space. But it takes time. This is not the forte of the U.S. We tend to be somewhat laissez-faire when it comes to standards, but we're really going to have to step up to the plate here and hopefully lead.
Yep. And just to add on to that, there's some good news here, but there's also some examples of this competition happening. On the competition side, a few years ago, the European Union started their own effort to develop best practices and standards for satellite servicing. It was done under something called Paraspora, which was part of the Horizons 2020 program initially. And what they were working towards, what they called the European Operations Framework, which was intended to be a set of standards and practices of how to do on-orbit servicing. And it was set up in the intent of focusing on European activities. And some sort of interpreted that as a direct competition to CONFERS, which was they saw as a U.S. effort. Now, the reality is that CONFERS in the very beginning was an international effort. It was created, it brought in international entities in the very beginning, we've done multiple briefings to UN Committee on the Peace of Outer Space and other multilateral bodies, brief different national entities. And actually, in reality, CONFERS had a good working relationship with the Paraspora effort, and there was some cross flow between those. But there at the national level, I think there is a bit of a desire, or at least just inclination, to see this in a competitive model, because everyone wants to boost their own space economy, their own space industry, right? The U.S., China, Europe, Russia, they all see this as potentially a way to get more economic benefits. But as was just pointed out, if you have multiple competing standards, that sort of locks out parts of the market and it stifles growth and it kind of hurts everything. So the good news is that there was that level of cooperation and some back and forth. And also the initial standard that CONFERS put forward was done through the International Organization for Standards, ISO, and had participation from about 12 or 13 different countries, including Russia, China, multiple European countries, Brazil, and India, and a few others. So there was an opportunity to provide comment, and the ISO standard that is now out, 24330, is an international standard, at least at this very high level.
Yeah, that was a huge win for CONFERS, getting that first ISO out. So what was the end result of the ESA effort? Where does it stand now?
So the European Operations Framework effort is still ongoing. Their plan was to do some initial studies and some thinking on what they might do, and then to do some on-orbit demonstrations to sort of prove out what really worked and what didn't work, and then use the end results of that real-world practice to codify something. So it was always meant to be a kind of a longer running effort to get to a standard in the end. So they're still waiting to do some of those on-orbit demonstrations.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, things in terms for me with ISAM, in terms of kind of international competition, I think about the lunar landing sites. How there's almost like this new space race with China. Who's going to plant their flag and their protection zone around it, their safety zone around it first, and what is that going to mean for sense of security, if you will, whether it's the U.S. security or allied security on the surface of the moon, and also the commercial stations. Right, we've got the Gateway that's going to be going up around the moon. We've got Tiangong, the Chinese station that's already being used and it's built. So, what about this kind of great power competition in terms of ISAM in the future of in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing around, like in orbit, as well as lunar, cislunar, beyond Mars, all of that? Any comments from either one of you? I'll take.
So I'll just start by saying, NASA and our of its partners are looking at ISAM as part of the return to the moon, and particularly the Gateway is not going to be crewed all the time. So this model we have with the ISS, where the human crew is doing a lot of maintenance and upkeep, is just not going to happen. there's going to need to be some level of robotic servicing to maintain and upkeep that station. And so they're looking at it in that context. And that's an international activity that there are, European partners, lots of others are going to be involved in that. So there's going to be a level of international cooperation there. When it goes to the lunar operations themselves, China and Russia have their own activity, the International Lunar Research Station that they've announced, and they're signing up some partners to work with them on that. They have not yet released their own set of principles for how they're going to be doing that, although they say they're working on them. I'll just say that what's in the Artemis Accords about the safety coordination zones, it's not a keep out. There's nothing in there about stopping someone from doing anything. It just says, if you're going to be in this area, we just need to coordinate. We just need to talk to each other. And that's because of some of the legal prohibitions on Article 2 and non-attribute, that's some of the Article 2 prohibitions on claiming territory and all that sort of stuff in the Outer Space Treaty.
Right.
So there is some discussion of this. And then back to sort of in Earth orbit, there's an interesting question about rescue vehicles and docking modules on these space stations, right? When we had the ISS, there was a lot of work that was put into having a standardized docking interface that could accept American, Russian, European, and now commercial vehicles. And of course, China has its own activities. To be honest, I'm not sure if the modules on the Chinese space station are entirely compatible with, the docking interfaces on the Chinese space station are entirely compatible with those on the ISS. I would hope they are. But as we're moving into this era where there might be multiple space stations that are crewed or uncrewed, and some by commercial and some by governments, this whole question of standards for that is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, the rescue boat. Our rescue boat should all kind of look the same.
Right. And one person's rescue boat should be able to rescue somebody else's, people from somebody else's station, right? And not just their own.
Absolutely.
That'd be really great, because that might be the only rescue boat available.
Right.
And of course, you talked. Sorry, Karen, did you want to comment on what you were saying? Because I had a question for you as a follow-up.
Back to the rivalry with China and the lunar surface, perhaps the real rivalry is not so much the lunar surface itself, but maybe some of the intellectual property. We keep in mind what this is all about. It's really about an ecosystem, innovation, and so on. So we have to really protect our IP, at the same time ensure that we have interoperable interfaces to collaborate and work together. So I hope that stays in the discussion as well in the future, which is how do we protect our IP going forward at the same time that we're working to collaborate and work together with other nations.
Okay. So we've only got a few minutes left, because this has been good though, but we've got about 5 minutes left ish. And I wanted to kind of hit one more thing before we finish. So we've talked about industry-led standards, and I'll start with you, Brian, on this. We've talked about industry-led standards making, with CONFERS and with the European model that was started around the same time. What are the benefits of this kind of consensus building versus the question of when guidelines are not enough? I'm thinking of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Well, it's really just a guideline, right? So you don't have to follow it.
The code, right? The Pirates code, yeah.
Yeah, right. So when is the guideline not enough, and we need to kind of convert to this top down?
Yeah. No, that whole question of how far voluntary agreements and practices can take you before you have to put it into a stricter, codified, even a hard law fashion, that is a huge open question that we're all still trying to work on. There's a couple of examples of this. So on the debris mitigation side, of course, we've had this thing called the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee. It's been around for 20 years now, that consists of all of the major space agencies that are doing guidelines for how to mitigate or lessen or reduce the creation of new space debris. And those are all voluntary at the international level. But at the national level, several countries, including the US, have put them in place and made them required through various policy and regulatory instruments for both government space activities and the private sector. So, for example, if you are launching a satellite and you get a license from the United States government, part of that license will require that you do a debris mitigation assessment of what kind of a risk that poses to the environment, and also submit a plan of how you're going to dispose of your satellite and everything else properly, including meeting what's known as the 25-year guideline for not leaving stuff in space. Just recently, the FCC has added a further restriction that if you're going to do a large constellation, that requirement is 5 years, not 25 years. So that's an example of how this interplay between sort of the voluntary practices and sort of this requirement. And there's also examples of several instances where industry groups or sets of companies have said they are going to comply with voluntary guidelines that go beyond what the government requires them. So, for example, the Space Safety Coalition, which is a group of more than 40 satellite operators and some other entities, has already said that they are going to comply with a 5-year or less deorbit timeline, even though they're not required to under most of the existing regulations. So there's definitely this back and forth. Also, economic incentives play into this, right? In some cases, you might want to put in place some sort of an economic incentive to comply rather than a hard regulatory rule. Or in other cases, you might want to put in a penalty that if somebody breaks the rule. And we just saw recently the FCC issued the first ever fine for a company that did not comply with what it said it was going to do in the debris mitigation plan. So there's really no answer here if I need to sum it up, right? It's this balance between these two things. There's an interplay. Sometimes the voluntary comes first and then you get the hard regulations. Sometimes the hard regulations come first and then you get the voluntary stuff. That's part of the reason this is a really complicated problem to solve.
So it was a good question then, because there is no answer.
There is no easy answer. Let's put it that way.
Karen, what do you have? Would you like to comment on that? What are the economic benefits of this kind of industry-led bottom up versus a top down? Is there a tipping point where it becomes not beneficial?
It's really the gray in between. I think it's government-led consensus standards. I think government has to be in a role to be part of this exploration process. It needs to occur now before too many vested equities build up with ISAM. We got to start this now. But I will say there is sometimes overstepping into too much prescription when it comes to standards. Understanding the outer part of the box, so to speak, in order to be interoperable is important. But for the private sector to compete and to compete with their unique innovations, they need their secret sauce. So don't overstep into where their secret sauce might lie. Respect that and only carry those standards so far. Allow competition, allow innovation. And that is the big pushback sometimes from industry, that standards can squash innovation. So respect that line, know when to stop with standardization, just enough to allow safety, performance, and interoperability.
Yeah. I'll just second that. That's hugely important. That came up a lot in the discussions within CONFERS and also what Paraspor is doing on the European side. And so far, I think we're getting that balance largely right. The government has not come out and said, you'll do this, this, and this. It's largely letting this sort of evolve, but that's exactly the concern, and it's a big thing to keep in mind. Well,
yeah, the special sauce, the IP, right?
And the innovation, right?
right, and that kind of leads to, more and more talk about kind of a capabilities-driven model versus a requirements. So let them decide how to get there.
Exactly.
Where you want them to get. So we're rounding out now. I'd like to ask each of you, and Brian, I'll start with you. What are some final thoughts? What are some priorities that you might want to leave the viewers? Is there something that I didn't ask about that you think people still should kind of walk away with and think about?
Yeah, I'll bring up the national security question here really quickly. We focused a lot on commercial standards and commercial practices and the regulation oversight, which is important. But there's also another aspect of this, which is the military national security application of many of the same technologies. And one of the reasons that we were focusing on these commercial standards is to help discriminate and help identify the commercial use of these activities separately from the now created military use, because it's really challenging when they all get kind of lumped together. You can't tell what is, a friendly commercial vehicle that might be coming to help me out versus the potential threat. And so that's a distinction is good. And while there's good progress on the commercial side, there is also need to work on standards and norms for how the military use of these applications is going to occur. And that conversation has not gotten as far, partly because of the security concerns, because classification concerns, and just the general geopolitical challenges in talking to US, Russia, China, and other countries on how to do all this. So I just want to flag that as an important piece that is a little bit behind, and we really need to also be working on.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, the dual use confusion. Karen, how about you?
Well, I'm just excited about interoperability, which means they're going to depend upon modularity. And modularity is the key for building out infrastructure in space. So I'm excited about that and where it can take us as various pieces become interchangeable. And I think it'll encourage more innovation, more plug and play. So this is very critical to get to that point where we have good consensus standards that the private sector can accept and work with. They will know what to build towards.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks both to Brian and Karen for being here. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's things that we missed, but we can't get it all in 30 minutes. So we just got to keep the conversation going. So thank you to our audience for watching or listening our 5th show in the ISAM series. You can browse our YouTube playlists or wherever you get your podcasts to find more of our shows. Check out the center's in-depth research by topic area at csps.aerospace.org. And thank you to James Liggins, our technical director. Until next time, thanks for joining.
Thank you.